The Marlborough Mound stands in the heart of Marlborough College in Wiltshire. It has a long and fascinating history, much of it only recently explored. After centuries of neglect, which had led to it becoming overgrown and inaccessible, a trust was established in 2001 to restore it and to study it properly. Since 2007, there has been an annual lecture about the Mound or a related topic at the college, and this is part of the 2020 lecture. Over the past 20 years, the Marlborough Mound Trust has conserved and explored the Mound in many ways. When we started, there were two major mysteries about the Mound. The first was, of course, whether it was a prehistoric earthwork or a Norman creation. Here we were very lucky. Following excavations at Silbury Hill in 2007 and 2008, Jim Leary and his team, with the support of English Heritage, settled the question. Drilling on the Mound was authorised, and the trust met the cost of getting the drilling rig to the top of the Mound. Cores taken from it in 2010 established that Silbury and Marlborough were closely linked in date and structure. The announcement of this dramatic discovery will certainly remain the high point of the Trust's work. Later surveys of about 50 other castle mottes have shown that Marlborough is possibly a unique example of the reuse of a prehistoric mound as the site of a Norman castle keep. The second mystery is what exactly stood on the top of Marlborough Mound. At the moment, we have very little evidence, and we await the results of a proposed archaeological dig to take place in the coming months. In order to understand the problems of finding the medieval archaeology of the Mound, we need to begin in the present and peel back the layers. So, I begin with the Mound today. If you take the splendidly restored spiral path up the Mound, the top is inevitably a disappointing contrast. There is a ring of earth with a concrete platform in the middle and a few remaining trees. You may well wonder what you are looking at. When the Trust started work on the Mound, it was seriously neglected, used chiefly for illicit smoking and drinking, with a hideous set of concrete steps which gave quick access to the top, and a chimney for the college laundry built into the side of it. Furthermore, the Mound was almost totally concealed by trees. Some had been planted deliberately, as we shall see, but there were also a mass of them which were self-seeded. This aerial view from the 1950s shows how dense the cover was. The open-air swimming pool, which, as you might expect, was extremely cold, I speak from experience, runs along the line of the castle moat, and the Mound itself is under the trees shown in green. If you climbed the steps in 2002, this is what you would have found. In the overgrown jungle, a huge water tank is hidden. The inspection ladder is on the left. The trees range from new saplings to 200-year-old limes, and there is little sign of any access paths through the undergrowth and general scrub. This is the water tank in 2005, after the first clearance of the overgrown mound had taken place. The tank was the last of a series of water supplies for the college, and before that for the house built by the Seymour family, which is now Sea House. Fortunately, the tank was assembled in sections, and the trust were able to remove it without much difficulty in 2008, when it became redundant. However, the concrete platform which remains was the base for this, and is unlikely to be removed, as it will be a difficult and damaging operation. The banks around the tank are the spoil heap for the excavation of the central area. This took place over 3 centuries as different methods of storing the water here were adopted. The immediate predecessor to the tank seems to have been an open reservoir, shown here on a plan of the college grounds in the 1840s. As the mound was covered with trees, the reservoir can hardly have been salubrious unless it was covered in some way or the water was filtered before use. Before the college leased what is now Sea House from the Seymour family, it had been used as the Castle Inn. Both of these occupants had altered the water system in turn. The original had been built in the 1630s by Sir Francis Seymour, and was described 30 years later as a fair cistern in the middle of the top of the mound, some 18 foot over and 4 foot high, into which there is water forced up by a water mill and force pump in lead pipes of some 3/4 of an inch bore, and between 300 and 400 yards long, from the mill set upon a brook. This cistern was not all that much smaller than the 20th century tank, and the structure would have occupied a large part of the summit. By 1674 it needed a fairly major refurbishment, and work was carried out on the cistern that included making a new timber frame, laying a new drain, setting up the pump, and work on the cramps to hold the rails around the cistern. Finally, the stairs to the cistern were mended. Ironically, the water supply function of the mound is the best documented part of our story tonight. We now turn to Sir Francis Seymour's garden, which he created in the 1630s. Once again, we need to proceed backwards to find the changing elements of the mound. We have already looked at the dense 20th century tree cover on the mound. This view is probably late 18th century and shows the tree cover and the beginning of the neglect of the mound. It is typical of a number of watercolours and sketches in the 18th and 19th century. The trees conceal the fact that there had once been a grand garden here with elegant buildings on the mound. Even in its decayed state, the garden was a tourist attraction. The sons of the Duke of Rochefoucauld were sent by their father to tour England in 1785. They were to report back to him on industrial and other matters. On their travels, they toured some of the great houses of England, and came to Marlborough in 1785, and noted that the limes had been planted on the summit in patterns of 5 or quincunxes. These would probably have been familiar to them, as La Rochefoucauld is north of Bordeaux, and at Bordeaux the Esplanade des Quinconces consists of lime trees in exactly this formation. Our best visual images of the mound and its garden are due to the antiquary William Stukely, who drew a detailed but sometimes imaginative plan and view of the garden in 1721. It shows an elegant summer house on the top of the mound. Some years earlier, Celia Fiennes, an inveterate visitor of country houses, noted it in her diary. This was at the end of the 17th century. She tells us that in the midst of the top of the mount was a house built at a pond, but that's fallen down. If she is right, the summer house must have been repaired between her visit and Stukely's drawing, because we have a description of the mound in 1664. Sir Robert Murray wrote a letter about it to the members of the newly formed Royal Society in London. He told them that the mound had a path which formed a spiral of 4 entire turns and about a quarter, making a very insensible ascent of some 700 yards in all, the walk being some 6 foot broad, handsomely gravelled, with a fine quickset hedge on the outside, with fruit trees of several kinds set in it. About the end of the 3rd turn there is a pretty arbour or resting place of hewn stone covered, and at the top a pretty green, compassed with the quickset hedge and fruit trees as the rest of the spiral walk, and in the middle a very fair and handsome octagonal arbour or room, some 24 feet wide, with a pair of stairs on one side. This is exactly what Stukely shows. Of the whole of the elaborate garden which he portrays, some of it may never have existed, but the chief feature of Francis Seymour's original garden, the spiral path up the mound, is very clearly there. It was noted by John Evelyn when he visited it in 1654, and of course is the most striking feature of the mound today. In summary, the mound was in its medieval form until the 1630s, and the original surface level remained the same until the lead cistern above ground level was replaced by a reservoir dug into the medieval surface. This was very probably done between 1785 and the 1840s, in other words, after the Rochefoucauld brothers visited it, and the date of the college map which shows its presence. In 1695, there was still something else besides the summer house and cistern visible on the mound. William Camden's Britannia, the classic account of the history and monuments of Britain, published in 1610, was revised by Edmund Gibson in 1695. Gibson adds to the original text an observation that there are indeed some few remains of the wall of the keep, and notes that the garden mound was contrived out of the keep of the castle. Stukely's engraving is not detailed enough to show these remains, and it is possible that they had been removed or covered before his visit in 1721. We know that such ruins existed a century and a half earlier. The scholar John Leland, travelling around England in search of ancient ruins and historic places, came to Marlborough in 1544 and remarked briefly that all that was left of the castle is a donjon half ruined. This implies rather more than the few remains which Gibson saw. What might this donjon half ruined been like when it was first completed? At the beginning of the civil wars between Stephen and Matilda, after the death of Henry I in 1135, the chronicler at Osney Abbey, near Oxford, records under the year 1138 that Bristol and Marlborough were the two best fortified castles in the southwest. He calls them munitissima, which implies that they were not only strongholds, but they were also well garrisoned and provisioned, ready for war in every aspect. Both had been royal castles, and were given by the Empress Matilda to Robert, Earl of Gloucester, the leader of her supporters in England. Robert rebuilt Bristol as one of the grandest castles in the region, and indeed in England. It was measured in the 15th century, and the figures that the writer gives are equal to 29 metres by 36 metres. It had towers at the corners and was designed to reflect the Earl's power. Marlborough's status was rather different. It was a second-rank royal castle, and the keep would in any case have been restricted by the pre-existing mound. The monk who wrote the Annals of Winchester, a year-by-year record of important events, tells us under the year 1138 that numerous castles were built in the West Country, notably by Henry of Blois, Bishop of Winchester and younger brother of King Stephen, and Roger, Bishop of Salisbury, who built Salisbury and Devizes. Robert, Earl of Gloucester, was responsible for building or fortifying 6 castles besides Bristol. 4 other men are named, among them John the Marshal. He may have been the castellan of Marlborough, and he seized the castle as a base for his own independent activities. He largely fought on his own account, sometimes in allegiance with Robert of Gloucester. Another writer says of John that he built castles designed with wondrous skill in the places that best suited him. The Winchester annalist says that John built or fortified both Marlborough and the castle at Ludgershall to the south of Savernake Forest. It seems very likely that the stone donjon, whose remains Leland saw, was the work of John. When John seized the castle, it was a royal castle, but there is no evidence in the royal accounts for the building of the keep. However, if it was built in Henry I's time, this could be simply because the records do not exist. If it had been created under Henry II or his sons between 1154 and 1216, the records are fuller, but it is only under Henry III that we begin to learn a great deal about building activity at Marlborough. There is only one entry in 1238 which relates to the keep, to which we will return in a moment. So, what can we deduce from other sources to give some idea of the strength and nature of the keep? Firstly, we have the site itself, though, as you will have gathered from the start of this lecture, it is so pulled about that even with the next round of archaeological investigation, due in the next few months, we shall be lucky to retrieve any tangible evidence. In 1936, H.C. Brentnall, a master at the college who wrote a number of important articles about the castle and mound, recorded in a brief note that what little remains above ground is to be seen on the summit of the motte, where a buttress of the keep was laid bare some years ago. There is no trace of this today, nor do we have any indication of when and where exactly it was found. So the only certain data is the size of the site on which the keep was built. The original platform at the top of the mound, shown in this diagram, seems to have been about 18 metres in diameter. The excavation of the pond or reservoir and the installation of the water tank meant that the medieval surface has either been destroyed or lies at an unspecified depth underneath the ring of soil which surrounds the concrete platform. This may sound a small space for a keep. However, the keeps of the early 12th century were functional buildings and only rarely, as at Bristol, built to impress. Here are two examples of 12th century castles. Bamburgh in Northumberland was a major royal castle, the largest in the north of England, yet its keep measures only 14 metres by 14 metres, much the same size as the estimated size of Marlborough. The picture of Gloucester Castle, set within the city, is a very rare early 14th century drawing of a real castle. It is an illumination in the margin of a copy of Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Britons. This picture of Chepstow shows the 11th century oblong tower. Ignore the upper story, which was added in the 13th century. The view is of the short side of the keep, which is more or less the size I would suggest for Marlborough. As with other lesser 12th century castles, it would have been 2 stories only, and the total floor area would be around 300 square metres, with a further 150 square metres on the roof and battlements. It is probably the nearest analogy to Marlborough Castle, even though it is some distance away on the Wye. The alternative is that Marlborough did have 3 stories, but although I am not a structural engineer, I think that prudence would dictate a design which would not be too heavy for the uncertain foundation provided by the existing mound. There was no way of telling how strong that mound was. Secondly, there is the evidence of the purpose of the keep itself. A garrison was maintained there in peacetime, as the castellan was responsible for paying for them out of the revenue from the castle lands. The only indication of the possible size of the garrison which we have is in 1264, when the castle was put on a war footing in anticipation of Simon de Montfort's rebellion. This enlarged war garrison consisted of 4 knights, 16 sergeants of arms, and 54 foot soldiers, who were there for 10 weeks. The keep would have been large enough to house them, albeit in cramped conditions. On the basis of the approximate measurements we have already given, this allows about 6 square metres per soldier. In broad terms, therefore, the garrison size confirms the suggested keep dimensions. The usual purpose of the keep was to act as a secure refuge in which the garrison could hold out for some time, even if the outer bailey was stormed and captured. It was the strongest structure within the castle, built of good stone. In the late 12th century, keeps were typically square, though experimental octagonal examples, as at Orford in Suffolk, and round towers are also found. Keeps are defensive structures and could withstand considerable bombardment by the stone-throwing machinery, the trebuchet, which was the attacker's chief weapon. Siege machines could also be used by the defenders. 2 years before the siege in 1217, King John had sent 11 ballistae, a kind of giant crossbow, and a supply of stones to Marlborough. We can gauge something of the nature of Marlborough's keep from the evidence of the 3 sieges that it underwent. The first recorded siege is in 1139, when King Stephen moved to retrieve the castle from John the Marshal, soon after John had defected to Matilda's side. The siege began in July, but when, on August the 1st, Stephen heard that Robert of Gloucester had landed in England and established himself at Arundel, he abandoned the operation and set out to attack Robert instead. We learn from this that Marlborough was an important enough target for the king himself to lead the army attacking it. The second siege was in 1194, when Hubert Fitzwalter, Archbishop of Canterbury, recaptured it from Prince John in anticipation of the return of Richard I from crusade. The siege lasted only a few days, and Fitzwalter, who had assembled a great army, went on to take 2 more neighbouring castles with little difficulty. The third siege is more interesting. Prince Louis of France invaded England in 1216, hoping to take advantage of the minority of Henry III, who was 9 years old. The Castellan of Marlborough surrendered the castle to Louis and joined his supporters. William Marshal, Regent of England, son of John the Marshal, sent his son to besiege Marlborough at the end of March 1217. The garrison put up a strong resistance and only surrendered at the end of April, not knowing that Prince Louis was on his way to relieve them. William, fearing that Louis would recapture the castles that his forces had recently taken, is said to have had them all demolished, with the exception of one key fortress at Farnham in Kent. At the moment we have no firm evidence as to how far this demolition went, whether it was real or rumoured, and whether Marlborough was in fact included in it. However, there is an entry in the royal accounts in 1238, when a lime kiln was installed for finishing the great tower of the castle. This could be read to imply the completion of relatively recent building works, as work on a 12th century tower would have been described as repairs to an existing structure. With so little to go on, I leave you with the tantalizing thought that Marlborough may have been built in 1138 by John the Marshal, demolished in 1217 by his son William, and rebuilt just before the tower was recorded as being completed by Henry III in the 1230s. I fear that this will have to remain a speculation. I leave you with the tantalizing thought that Marlborough may have been built in 1139 by John the Marshal, demolished in 1217 by his son William, and rebuilt by Henry III in the 1230s. I fear that this will have to remain a speculation. What does seem reasonably certain is that the missing keep was probably a square 2-storey structure of medium size. We come back at the end to the Norman reuse of the prehistoric mound as a castle motte. Marlborough is among the handful of such mottes over 10 metres high, and even in this group is one of the highest at nearly 19 metres. It is also one of half a dozen sites where a pre-existing natural or man-made feature has in some way contributed to the making of the motte. The Normans who first saw it must have realized that it was almost a perfect example in size and shape, steep-sided and very defensible. It was naturally munitissima, very well fortified.